banyan tree leadership, but necessarily that is not a good leader because it doesn't allow new leaders to grow underneath. It cuts the light underneath. The banana tree leadership, it grows and there are so many shoots. It nurtures, it fosters. My parents threw me into the jungle, left me on my own to navigate in a school. They just left me in a school and came back. I picked up, of course, children are mean. They said mean things, but we don't remember those things. Then they become friends. They come with a different expectation, but when they walk in, they see the 65-inch TV there. It's an open space. There's a lot of sunlight, and it is a happy, vibrant space. Just because these are homeless women, there is no way that they should live in spaces that are cramped up, or this shouldn't be sad spaces. It should be lively and happy spaces. When I was working in the government, I had teams that I was managing with 2,000 and 3,000 people. And then I went to the shelter with just 4 and 5 people, tiny team, and we shouldn't be afraid of these ups and downs, big growth and small growth. And the only way to do it is to do it. So there is no other shortcut. That's a message for the Gen Zs.
She's a doctor who reshaped public health systems, a disability rights activist who turned lived experience into policy change, and a woman who believes disability is not tragedy but possibility. From leading national HIV programs that impacted over 5 lakh lives to building safe spaces where women with disabilities can dream freely, Dr. Aishwarya Rao joins Expressions to talk about health, gender rights, resilience, and why dignity must always come before sympathy. This is a conversation about courage, choice, and creating a better world, one decision at a time.
Hi, today I'm joined by a very special guest, Dr. Aishwarya Rao. Let's get to know her journey and let's get to chat with her. Hi, Doctor. Thank you so
Hi.
much for joining me today. I'm very excited to learn about you and your journey.
Thank you, Neha. Thank you for having me on your podcast today.
Thank you. So, I just want to start by asking you, how did this journey start? What were your inspirations, any influences, any people who left an impact on you while you were starting off?
Starting off from childhood, I think I always say this. My school headmistress was one of the early prominent
Influence.
influences in my life. I owe a great deal to her, and I have to mention her. That's Mrs. Williams, Mrs. Ahalya Williams. She was the principal of what was Bain School, Annanagar, and which later became CSI Jesse Moses School. So I joined. I didn't go to school actually, and there was no LKG and UKG. I went straight to third standard. So she took me in, and I was homeschooled until then. My mother was, and of course, my parents are the other influence. My mother had a minimum education herself. She could read and write English, but she was not very conversant with English. What she knew, she taught me, and she used to buy all those storybooks. When we were kids, we used to have a lot of those Russian storybooks, picture books. So she and I, both of us, used to read those books. That was my early education, and then of course, Mrs. Williams took me in straight into third standard. So
Okay.
I think, yeah, I owe to these two ladies a great deal.
Okay. And what started off with your career? How did you start off in your career?
Career, I mean, it just went. You don't go with the. Of course, there is a dream, and you say that I want to become a doctor. I want to become a this and that. I mean, as kids, we are all talking about that, but it was like you're in a conveyor belt, and you just do one thing and the next and the
Yes,
next.
yes.
You go as life flows. You just go with that. So I think that's what happened. I'm extremely fortunate that I was born into a house. I won't say it was a privileged house, but I was born to very nice parents who were extremely
Supportive.
supportive, and I went to a school that was very supportive. So I think I had that uh,
Backup.
backup and that cushioning
Yeah.
there. So I think that played a great deal.
Major
So
role.
now I run the shelter for women with disabilities, and I see they don't have the opportunities I had. So I think I had a very good head start there.
Yeah. So, ma'am, you've been doing a lot, but I want to ask you, what is the one initiative that you're particularly proud of over your expansive career?
See, my work, I can um, divide it into, I think, two or three phases. One, my work immediately after I finished my post graduation with children pediatrics, I started working in a non-governmental organization called World Vision. So that was where we started working with children with HIV. My original work was for several years with HIV. So at that time, in 2000 and 2001 and 2, there was not much awareness or knowledge about how to there was a lot of stigma and fear
Yes.
surrounding the disease. It was a killer disease. No medicine was available for people to use. So at that time, uh, I was young. I just had finished my post graduation, so learning about it. So the NGO space was a space where I could uh, learn a lot of it. We There were no courses. We weren't taught this in college also, so we picked up a lot from the internet, and from modules from CDC and WHO, from all their
Yeah.
the material that they were putting out. So that is how on the go need basis we were picking up this, and I started treating children and their mothers and families with HIV. So my HIV work is for the first 15 years of my career. That was the thing, clinical and then research. Then I went into what is now NIRT, National Institute of Research in Tuberculosis. I worked with under Dr. Soumya Swaminathan. She was heading the department for trials for HIV and TB trials. So I joined there as a senior research fellow. So the next 5 to 6 years I worked in TB research, working again with the same group of people, actually, because in Chennai it is the same
Yes.
cohort of people that I worked in the clinic, in the NGO. We recruited all of them into the study, because in the study they had access to medication and a lot of investigative
Yeah.
facilities. So they were all eligible, and they were all recruited into the thing. So it was great learning. So my NGO clinical work and then research work, and then I joined into the government. After that, the Tamil Nadu AIDS Control Society, I joined society as a consultant. So I worked there until 2012. So in the Tamil Nadu AIDS Control Society and the National AIDS Control Organization, I worked both in Tamil Nadu and in Andhra Pradesh. So in Andhra Pradesh, I was there 3 years. So it was the initial rollout of the antiretroviral therapy program. So when we started, I had a head start because I had already worked with people, and I had experience both in research and in clinics. So I had actually treated people, which most government hospitals
Were
and
not
most
experienced.
medical medicine departments,
Yeah.
professors of medicine
Yeah.
hadn't treated.
Yeah.
So we had that experience before that. And then, of course, with the national program coming in April 2004, the National AIDS Control Antiretroviral Therapy Program was rolled
Launched.
out.
Mm.
So when that was rolled out, and I was automatically in they asked me to join. So I started program management. So that was completely managing programs, ensuring that the guidelines are followed, ensuring that every district has we call it the rollout. Every district has an antiretroviral therapy center, that there are recruitments, trainings, ensuring that there's a supply of drugs, clinical services, ensuring that these services are integrated within the regular delivery of services, and our people with HIV are integrated into the general care in the hospitals. Like if there is a pregnant positive mother, that she will not just come to the clinic, but if she needs other services, every other department is ready to, because of the stigma at that time. So it was we had to sensitize that and train the entire hospital. So that sort of a work. So that was government work. I worked in the government, but as a consultant. So I was very much within the government framework. So these were the, so this is a bulk of my, for what I studied, I worked. Then in 2012, by that time, the the program had mainstreamed. It had become well entrenched with the government was running the program quite
Efficiently
robustly,
now. Yeah.
efficiently. All the systems were in place. So then I thought it's time for me to move on. My heart is for starting something from scratch.
Yeah.
So when it was running well, it was time to phase out. So then at that time, 2012, I took a sabbatical, and also by that time, working in the government has its challenges. There were certain situations, let us say. So it was automatic that I felt it's good time to
Leave.
come out, leave, and then set up a trust, my own organization, and started wanted to work with disability. So I'm a person with disability, and I had never worked in the field of disability. That had been really
Close to your heart.
that had been bothering me, that I've never, I actually never identified myself as a, I mean, visibly, it is, you can see that I'm a person with disability, but I never worked in disability. So it was a learning curve. I had to learn what is disability and how many types of disabilities and all the ins and outs. So then from 2012 started doing trainings, understanding how the, because disability is a very well developed sector. So for me to gain entry into the sector took a um, bit of trying, because they considered me an outsider. One, it is a very male dominated sector at that time, 2012 and 13. Now the scenario has become more
Evolved.
evolved and equitable. So then me coming in there, I was looked out. I felt I was an outsider, so I had to get in. And then by 2016, we set up this shelter for homeless women with disabilities under Greater Chennai Corporation immediately after the Chennai floods. So the Chennai floods in
Yeah.
2015 December was one of the reasons why we felt there was a need for a shelter, and then we set it up. Long answer for your
No, no,
short question.
no. I'm so coming to that. I had a question about HIV that you mentioned, where you worked
Mm,
intensively. So, like you mentioned that there was a stigma of fear.
mm.
So, weren't you scared too? I mean,
No, we were younger, so we didn't really see. We had the knowledge that if you hold somebody or
yeah,
hug somebody, you eat along with them. It's not going to
yeah,
spread. That information was there, but then even if that information hadn't been there, I wouldn't have, and other young people like me, we wouldn't have.
HIV.
Yeah, looking back, no, no, that idea doesn't even
And
come.
having worked so closely with the patients, what did you feel was the main reason for this, ma'am?
It came into India. They say it originated in Africa, and then of course in the
Yeah,
Bay Area there was this
yeah.
thing. So anyway,
And
travel.
we know a few causes of it, but in Chennai,
Initial part
yeah,
of the epidemic, it is a pandemic. We used to
yeah,
call it a pandemic at that time. Initial time when there was no medicines, around 98 2000, around that time. 97 was the first case of HIV detected in India, in
Chennai.
Chennai. Dr. Suniti Solomon and Dr. Jacob from CMC Vellore tested and
Yeah.
found, they wrote about it. So from that time onwards, by the time 2002 and 2003, when I started working fully, the main spread was sexual route, unprotected sexual encounters between a male and a female,
But
and
ma'am, you were
most of the
saying
time
that children were also affected by it.
children come from the women who are infected.
Oh,
Mostly it is sexual route. Men who are truckers or who are migrating from one place to another, and when they are out of home, they visit women who are commercial sex workers, female sex workers. So this was the route. So there were pockets of HIV. One major pocket was Bombay, And then there were other pockets, like, there were high risk, red zones, high prevalent zones, Namakkal. Then there was Guntur, that sort of.
Yeah.
Then of course Northeast. So these were
Red
the
zones.
red zones.
Mhm.
So men who were traveling used to pick it up, get infected, come home, and then infect their
Family.
wives.
Mhm.
And when women get infected, young women, and they get pregnant, the pregnant positive women used to pass it on to their,
Oh.
vertically it used to spread to their
Children.
children. So this was the route. Initially, this was the route. And the other route, so the trucker, and then the highest risk was marriage, because
Yeah.
women were getting infected and children because of
Yeah.
them. The other thing was injecting drug users. That is in the Northeast. That was a big cause. It was quite a high infectivity was there. The risk was higher from exposure. The other thing was uh, men who are having sex with men, and then trans sex workers. So these were the high risk groups. This was, and then of course from blood transfusions.
Yes.
So but these were the initial mode of transmission was with the
So
risk
these.
groups. But now then it went from the high risk groups into the general population. So now it could be, it could be anyone.
Yes, ma'am. So, ma'am, when you started working with the disability group of people,
Mm.
did you set out to start a movement? And what was your vision by then? And did you imagine that what the impact of your work would be?
I don't believe in doing things on a uh, with a
Planned way.
flash, or with a, even when we start out our thing, we don't do big events. We never do big events. Everything is a soft launch, and we just do it like everyday work,
Affair.
a little by little by little. And having worked in the government where there's high pressure, no, every day you have to show results. Within 6 months you have to open so many centers, so many targets. And that was the way in which I had worked for 15 years. It's always, every day is a crisis, and crisis solving, and putting out fires. So I decided, when I run my own organization, it will not be like that. We will take our time, and there is no pressure, and we will do it. We will learn. We will go with our.
Flow.
We will find our own pace. We do have pressure, but it intentionally, I ensured that we don't put unnecessary uh, pressures on ourselves. So for the first 6 months in the shelter, we had only 8 or 9 women.
Women.
So we didn't say, oh, we have a capacity of 50, we have to fill them. We didn't do that. 8. And then they became 15 and 20, and then they went to 60. Now we have 75 women. So it is we wanted to grow uh, generically, but
Organically.
organically. Yes, that's the word. But we wanted to understand and be intentional about everything that we do. What are the needs? Are we addressing the needs? Are we doing something which others are not doing?
Yeah.
Is there a gap?
Yeah.
And that is the thing that we wanted to
Yeah.
address. So
Yeah.
it took time.
Yeah.
So now this is the 10th year. This April we've completed 10 years. So I
Wonderful.
think, then looking back, when in the initial days it looked like nothing seems to be happening for months, nothing is moving, but I never felt the pressure. Others who used to, I have young board members on my team, so they'll say, Aish, you have to be aggressive, you have to go, you're too you know
Easy.
you they didn't say slow, but they wished I were faster. But now I look back, and 10 years we've covered quite
Yeah.
a lot of
Yeah.
ground. So I decided that this will be the pace that we
Yeah.
move at.
Yeah. Ma'am, and also want to understand that through this, what is significant social impact you've made already and are making with lives?
See, initially what we wanted only a little shelter for women with disabilities, but it was a very small shelter. It was in a dilapidated, old, rundown, broken school building with crumbling, sinking floors, with overflowing toilets, with infrastructure that was literally breaking. But then we convinced the government to demolish that old, um, disused, old building. Now we have this April we went into a new, extremely disabled friendly very inclusive, safe space for women with disabilities, uh, where it's a comfortable space with a gym in it, and a nice reception, a common hall that is, lounge area with dining hall, a good space we've been able to create.
Comfortable space.
So when people actually walk into the shelter, they think it's also partnered with the government, so it's a shelter. So people come with an idea of a shelter space. I don't know what they think, but they think um that this is not a they come with a different expectation, but when they walk in, they see the 65-inch TV there, a very comfortable, free space. It's an open space, there's a lot of sunlight, and it is a
Yeah, ma'am.
happy, vibrant space. So we think just because these are homeless women, there is no way that they should live in spaces that are
Yeah.
like that. So
Cramped up.
yeah, cramped up, or well, this shouldn't be sad spaces. It
Yeah.
should be lively and happy spaces. So I think that that mentality itself, that you break that
Thinking.
the thinking itself, for me, I think that's an important message we send out.
Yeah.
And and because you live in a space like that, our women are also aspirational.
Yeah.
They want to be better, and it teaches us and them. The space talks to us,
Yes, ma'am.
so
If you live in an environment which is happy, obviously you deliver also.
you
happiness.
deliver also, and it also sets them up to a better standard of what they can expect
Yeah.
from themselves,
Yeah.
so they're doing better.
Any-
It's meant a lot. So I think the whole idea of government space must be like this, that we are breaking. And so now our women are doing so well in sports, and I think
Yeah.
we are able to tap as much resources as possible that are available.
Yeah.
So that is one achievement that, for me, these are small achievements, but I think they're significant achievements for us, that we are able to cover a lot more women. And uh, I won't say it's an achievement, but it's a part of a milestone that we covered, is that we were a small organization with a small turnover, little bit of work, like I told you, because I purposefully didn't become too ambitious in driving
Beginning, yeah.
uh, the initiative that we were
Project, yeah.
doing. But in 2024, the World Bank and the Disability Department of Tamil Nadu, they sent out a bid for something called the TN Rights Program. It's a community-based rehabilitation initiative. It's a very large program, very ambitious program of the government, very holistic program. And we didn't think we'll qualify for it, but we bid for it anyway, and we won 4 districts. So I think that was a significant jump for us, leap
Yeah.
for us, because now we are working in 4 different districts, and we are covering about 3.5 million households with disabilities. We're covering every person with disabilities in these. That's the coverage. So I think so, from a shelter with 50 women with disabilities,
Moved.
we've leaped here.
Yeah.
So I think that has been natural progression of
Yeah.
the work.
Yeah.
Yeah, so our scope has widened.
Also, ma'am, you've been a vocal advocate for accessibility in sports and also opened a sports gym for women with disabilities. So, how did this come about? And can you share an experience that highlighted the need for better accessibility in this field?
Yeah, over the years, all our women, for sports, we have to use facilities for training. We were always using the SDAT stadiums.
But how did you think of sports, ma'am, suddenly?
Because sports, around the time we opened the shelter, there were these organizations that were the Basketball Association of Tamil Nadu, the Basketball Association of Wheelchair Basketball Association of India. They were already doing annual workshops.
Yeah.
And then couple of the sports women actually came into our
Okay.
shelter. And then we knew that, so here were already couple of them, Matilda and Mary, had already been, they had gone for the workshops. So we knew that sports is the next thing. So we were all able to sense that, visualize that. At around that time only, Mariappan got the the only medal for India from um, South American, from the Olympics, the only medal that India got. So we knew sports is going to develop, and we thought we should um,
Work
it
towards
yeah,
it.
we should work on that. And sports is such a feel good happy
Yeah.
thing,
Yeah.
no? So I also initially trained along with the women, and I loved practicing, and I loved going for the workshops and all of that.
Okay.
So yeah, so I thought it's physically and personally also it's a great initiative. So
Yeah.
then, of course, the team became very serious, like regular practices. They stopped going for work and concentrating, like professional
Yeah.
training they were getting into.
Okay.
So we have para sports teams, then we have wheelchair basketball team, then racing team, powerlifting team, then para table tennis. So a lot of teams.
What do you play, ma'am?
I used to play the wheelchair basketball and I used to swim,
Okay.
but I need to get back into it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do it only for my personal.
But you still have the gym going on for
The
this.
gym is going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, we go whenever there's time. I'm not using the gym myself regularly, but everybody in the shelter is. The sports women are using it. Other no, those who are not in sports also use the gym.
Okay.
So we felt we needed the gym because there are no gyms anywhere that are catering to persons with disabilities, particularly women with disabilities. Most gyms are inaccessible, and if you go there, also the equipment is not. So
Suitable.
these are universal sports equipment only, but we've tweaked them in such a way that you can sit in your wheelchair or you can easily transfer. You just made minor tweaks, but they are disabled friendly equipment.
So, ma'am, do you think in general people with disabilities have to work harder to achieve their goals because of the stereotypes that exist in society? And do you also believe that women face additional challenges in this regard?
It's not a yes or a no question. Sometimes it's very easy, sometimes it's very difficult. See, the initial at the entry level, it's easy because people teams want to show we are diverse, and they love to have you on, and they want to feel, teams want to feel good about themselves, so they take you in. So the entry level is okay, but when you go into a team and you start competing and you start doing well, as you rise up the ladder, one, because you're a woman, there are we know that men won't agree, but we know as women that there are
Yeah.
definitely gender biases there. So there is a disability bias within
Yeah.
team. But I find at the entry level it's not there, because most teams now, because with now one the law says there is a reservation, and then most teams also have, most private setups have a DI policy, so they're very happy to take in people. But as you climb the rungs, it becomes it's my personal
Experience.
experience. And there are spots available in private, but there aren't enough people that are a correct match for who they are looking for, so that is also there.
Ma'am, also you're trying to change the Constitution of India. What does adding one word impairment actually change for millions of lives? Tell us something more about it.
Yeah, we're talking about this equality. I mean, the Constitution of India guarantees equality irrespective of gender, sex, caste, race, I mean religion and all. We want to also the Constitution to include the word in spite of irrespective of ability impairment. So that is something that we've always.
Where have you reached?
It was a campaign before COVID. It was quite a vociferous campaign, but right now I think with every season our focus changes. Right now we are looking at access, especially public mobility, transport
Yeah.
issues, and city infrastructure. So these are more pressing right now.
Yes,
So I think that has become a little bit in the back burner. At one point we were doing quite a lot of activity around that. Yeah.
So, for women with disabilities, how much of a fight is it to simply be heard? And you said even with women with disabilities, they discriminate against each other, right?
Yes, yes.
And
Within every group, there is
yeah,
this power dynamics
yeah.
is there.
So why does power always find a way to hurt?
I think that's the way the world functions. It's always the married woman thinks she's superior to the unmarried woman. The mildly disabled woman thinks she's better off than the moderate and the severe. There is this little power play. I think these are this is how the world is built.
Human emotions.
Yes, human emotions. We have to navigate these spaces. We have to have the skill sets to navigate these
So you mentor
spaces.
them, ma'am, then?
I think each one mentors one another. We have talks, we have classes, and on a need basis we do. But I think it's a quite a slow absorption of the environment. You learn from one another
Yeah.
with specific how you deal with issues. Then that's how the learning happens.
What do you think are the changes that are needed in our national health system, care system, to better support individuals with disability?
A lot. So it
Tell us
isn't
some.
articulated, the national health policy or the state, because health is a you know state also is in charge of health. It is not clearly articulated about how the people with disabilities will be included across. There are so many health schemes and programs, but in each one it's not monitored along how many people with disabilities accessed, what were the difficulties they had. So there is no that data uh, collection and review is not happening. I think in every scheme across men, women, children, I think that line, that parameter must be captured and it must be addressed. So I think that's not happening at all. It's just silent, so I think that needs to happen,
Immediate
and
attention.
immediately, and we need to start with the state only.
Are there any three things that community, society, politicians can do
Mm.
to help address the root of the problem that you are trying to solve?
We can't solve anything unless all the three elements, three, I would say four, which will be the government,
Yeah.
bureaucracy, the technocracy, and civil society. So, including persons with disabilities and their
Yeah.
organizations. So, until all four come together and we see eye to eye, this won't happen. I think all four need to come together.
Yeah.
So, this is the thing we saw in HIV. That was a standard textbook. I don't know how it happened, but it happened. Everyone were aligned together. That is why within a span of less than 20 years, HIV became a dreaded disease into uh, chronic manageable illness. So we saw that happen there, but there was this urgency, and there was a lot of public funding. There was international commitment, and again funding and everything. Everybody came together at that time. Those were good times,
Yeah.
20 years back, when we didn't have this us versus them, and how the world is now torn into
Groups.
groups that are not seeing eye to eye. No, it wasn't the world at the turn of
I
the
agree.
20 years ago.
Yeah.
So it was possible to do a lot more. Now it's a much more fractured world. It is difficult. So I think I don't know. We must find common ground, and I do think that disability is an issue that cuts across divisions. So I think it can be a unifying issue. It can be a unifying talk on one issue. Irrespective of our differences, we can come together and do. So I think we are very hopeful. All of us are hopeful that in the days to come we will see a lot more
Changes.
changes in disability.
So, how do you define leadership? And can you explain what you mean or give an example?
Yes, this is it's a favorite topic of mine about leadership. And yesterday I was talking to my team, um, the district teams, and I was talking. There were two, the Dharmapuri team and the Ranipet team. I was comparing them, and we were just having a friendly talk. Their styles of leadership. One is the banyan tree leadership. It looks strong. It looks big with all those big roots, and imposing big leader, but necessarily that is not a good leader because the big structure cuts out light, and it doesn't allow new leaders to grow underneath. It cuts the light underneath. And there is something called the banana tree leadership. Banana is not a tree, but it is we call it the banana tree leadership. It grows, and there are so many shoots. It nurtures. There's a lot more leaders. It it fosters. So I think we all need to be banana tree leaders. You don't need to be strong and in your face, a big leader and all of that. You can be quiet, but you must be nurturing and allow others to
Grow too.
grow.
Yeah.
So I think a leader must allow others to grow. And when the leader is, the test of leadership is when the leader is not there, how the second line and the third line, they take over and they do as if
Running successfully.
running the smooth transition.
Yeah.
The absence of the leadership must not be felt.
Yeah.
That is leadership.
Nice. Very well said, ma'am. And what are your 5 things I wish someone told me when I first started?
Oh my god. That money will come. Money will not be an issue because people actually are in need of good work. So people will find you. We don't really need to. Initial days are a struggle, but right now we actually don't go out asking people for money. People come and we
Support.
get references, and they are they are keen to partner with us. So money is never an issue. I wish I had known that, so I wouldn't have had sleepless, fretful nights in the beginning days. Another thing is that you should be not afraid of leaving something when
Letting
something,
go.
yeah, letting go. About legacy, no. Oh, I did this, and I come back. Now actually I've come back from the HIV. I started so many ART centers, but if I go there, nobody will recognize me. No, they won't know my name also. We have to forget about
Detach and let go.
let go. That let go is something, and start new. Don't be afraid of new beginnings. I think now I'm 53 years old. I used to work with huge 1,000 member teams. When I was working in the government, I had teams that I was managing with 2,000 and 3,000 people. And then I went to the shelter with just 4 and 5 people, tiny team. It's a big
Change.
it's a big
Yeah.
change. But we went on. But now again we've grown. And so this is a cycle, and we shouldn't be afraid of these ups and downs. No, big growth and
Yeah.
small growth. Even at small, we are continuing to
Yeah.
learn and grow and do things. So I think these are 3 things I would
Yes.
I don't know if they will tell me, but I will pass on this
From your experience.
from my experience.
Yes.
And the only way to do it is to do it. So there is no other shortcut. That's a message for the Gen Zs.
Gen
Because
Alpha, ma'am.
Gen Alphas, because everything they think everything is a click of a button
Yeah.
and swipe of
Yeah.
a screen. No, you have to go to the you
Yes.
have to go uh, to the ground. I mean, that is where the action is. So I think these are 4 things I would pass on to somebody.
So, for parents who may learn that their child may be disabled and have challenges ahead of them, what advice would you give them in terms of navigating the unknown and being the best parent they can be for their child?
This was the first lesson that I picked up when I was doing my pediatrics. Actually, it's a story I always tell everyone. I was in the final year in Ramchandra Medical College. I was doing. There was one rich parents. We call them rich because there's something called the affluent ward there, and they had a child with spina bifida, um, about 6-7 years old. Spina bifida is the lower limbs are paralyzed, and sometimes the bowel incontinence is there, and there is fluid accumulating in the brain, so they have to do a shunt to between the ventricular fluid into the spinal canal. So this kid, they didn't send to a school. That is the point. They thought if we send our child into the school, into the community, afraid of how uh, other kids will tease and how they will face, it will be
Bullied.
difficult, and they'll be bullied, and so they give very protected environment. So the first, so when I met the kid, and my parents threw me into the uh, deep
Jungle.
jungle, left me on my own to navigate in a school. They just left me in a school and came back, but I picked up, of course children are mean, they said mean things, but we don't remember those things. Then they become friends, and they'll be really, and now there's so much of soft parenting and I don't know, super parenting going on. Parents control. I think parents must trust and let go of children. So the first thing I told those parents were, send the kid to a school. They hadn't sent the kid to a school, so send the kid to a normal school and enable. So I think when first acceptance, it will come. Initially it will be difficult, but soon it will come. The acceptance will come, but and it shouldn't overwhelm them so much, so that they get caught up in the care of this kid, that they don't, they neglect themselves or neglect the other kids,
Yeah,
the other non-disabled kids. No, that should treat the kid
equally.
equally. And then find, of course,
Yeah.
you have to find a group. You have to share with peers, and now it is a tough journey, but there is support available, and you have to seek it.
Yeah.
So I think that is the thing. But from the point of view, from the kids point of view, I think you have to be willing for the kid to
Learn.
to
Fall and
learn,
learn.
to learn on their own.
Yes. And how do you use your presence on social media to further that advocacy? I mean, that you're using it.
There was a time when we were always on social media.
Yeah.
Now kind of we are tapering off, because now it's like, Facebook is only for people my age.
Mm.
Everybody's on Insta, and Twitter is a mean place. So now it's new learning again. We're trying to see, the LinkedIn is the thing now
Yeah.
for connecting, for
Yes.
for issues like the work that we are doing. So we're trying to, but there was a time when Facebook was so helpful
Yeah.
to find our tribe. I think like 10 years back, 15 years back, from all over India, from all over the world, we were connecting with people, and we were able to share so much, learn so much. I think it played a
Big role.
big role. So now I'm finding that role becoming murky, but I think we will once again, but
Would we work on it?
it will work. Yeah, but we have to engage with
Yeah,
social
no.
media, and we're very conscious about using social media.
For some, activism is what they do.
Mm.
For others, it's a part of who they are.
Mm.
So, how did you find your calling?
Right now, I don't call myself an
Activist.
for want of another word, I use the word activism, but I don't see myself as an activist. I'm just
Voice for the
a
others.
worker. I work with people with disability. I just want to be known as somebody who works in the field, not as an act, because activism again is poorly understood as being, especially in the Western all, it's being,
Yeah.
your left and your this. That's another. Here, of course, we can't take that. There are two kinds of negotiations when you want change to happen. One, you fight and you're aggressive, and you fight against the system. Another, you fight with the system and within the system. I am in solidarity with the
Yeah.
first approach, but more solidly we are seeing work. For us, this sort of activism is helping us. We're seeing more work, and that's why we're working within the government, closely with the government. So all our work is negotiation, inside, knowing whom to talk to, when to talk to, what to ask, and how to ask. That sort of an expertise we're still learning. We can never, we'll have surprises always, but that is the long, the difficult road we choose to take. Less glamorous, and the more difficult route we choose to
Yes,
take.
ma'am. Finally, so what lies ahead for Dr. Aishwarya Rao in the immediate future?
I want to work only for the next 5 years. I'm retiring after that. I'm going to read a book and paint and sip on my glass of wine, and I just want to watch the team do the work. I told myself another only 5 more years. So we want to set up a forever home, because every day we get calls from parents, from family members, but especially when parents are dead and they have family members who are severely disabled. What happens to them after us? And this is something that the state is not prepared for, that care. Even our home is a shelter, so women can come and go. They have to care for themselves,
Yeah.
so to speak. We can't bathe them or we can't feed them. That's not the
Yeah.
facility that we have. But someone who has those high needs, what happens to them once their parents are old themselves or when they are not there? So that is a big gaping need. So we want to set up a model, advocate for more. We haven't started that. We are started that advocacy, but like the state must be responsible, and we want to have a plan for that. There should be forever homes where parents can, without because otherwise, I mean, how do you account for this population? We have to do something. I think that will be, if at all we do, that is something that is really an area I want to work in.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much for this conversation today. I think it's been so enlightening, and I'm really proud of what you're doing. And I mean, whatever you're doing really matters. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Neha. Thank you. It's been a real conversation. I love talking to you.
Same.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Disability is not something to overcome. It is something that teaches you how to fight, negotiate, and love life more deeply. From public health to parasports, from shelters to cinema, Dr. Aishwarya Rao reminds us that real change begins when people are allowed to choose for themselves and are supported while doing so.